Chapter 1. The Stopped Clock. St. Mary Mead in early spring possessed a particular tranquillity that Miss Jane Marple had always treasured. The cherry blossoms along the vicarage lane had begun to unfurl their delicate petals, and the morning air carried the sweet promise of warmer days. It was precisely this serenity that made the news of Reverend Clement's death all the more shocking when it rippled through the village. Miss Marple had been pruning her roses when her faithful maid Cherry burst into the garden, her young face flushed with exertion and distress. "Oh, Miss Marple, such terrible news! The vicar, he's been found dead in his study." Miss Marple straightened slowly, one gloved hand pressed against the small of her back. At her age, sudden movements were inadvisable, particularly when one had been bent over garden beds for the better part of an hour. "Dead, Reverend Clement? But I saw him only yesterday at the church committee meeting. He seemed in perfect health. Dr. Haydock says it was his heart, miss. Mrs. Price from the post office told me when I went to collect your letters. The vicar's housekeeper found him this morning, sitting at his desk, as if he'd simply fallen asleep." Miss Marple removed her gardening gloves and placed them carefully on the wrought iron table beside her shears. "Poor Mrs. Wilson must be quite distraught. The Reverend was always most considerate of his staff. The whole village is talking of nothing else, miss. They say he must have passed late yesterday afternoon. His pocket watch was stopped at 3:45. A curious expression flickered across Miss Marple's face. His pocket watch? The antique gold one he inherited from his grandfather. "That's the very one, miss. The doctor said it must have stopped when the vicar did." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I think I should pay a call on poor Mrs. Wilson. One should offer what comfort one can at such times." 20 minutes later, Miss Marple was making her way along the high street toward the vicarage, nodding politely to the various villagers who stopped to exchange hushed comments about the morning's tragic event. The news had indeed spread rapidly, and already the wild speculation that inevitably accompanied death in small communities had begun. The vicarage, a handsome Georgian building of weathered brick, stood in stark contrast to the smaller cottages that lined the lane. Its gardens, nowhere near as well tended as Miss Marple's own, nonetheless provided a dignified setting for the residence of St. Mary Mead's spiritual leader. Mrs. Wilson, red-eyed but composed, admitted Miss Marple to the house with a quiet deference that spoke of years of service. "He was a good master, Miss Marple, never a harsh word, not like some I could name." She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that had seen considerable use that morning. "Would you care to sit in the drawing-room? Inspector Slack is with the doctor in the study just now." "Inspector Slack?" Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Has the police surgeon been called then?" "Standard procedure," the inspector said. "When someone dies alone." Mrs. Wilson sniffed disapprovingly. "As if there could be anything suspicious about the vicar's passing. A kinder, more godly man never walked this earth." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "Still, I suppose the inspector must do his duty." At that moment, Inspector Slack emerged from the study, his notebook in hand, his expression as dour and officious as ever. He gave a curt nod upon seeing Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be here. Paying your respects, are you?" "Good morning, Inspector. Yes, I've come to offer what comfort I can to Mrs. Wilson." The inspector snapped his notebook shut. "Well, don't go putting ideas in anyone's head. Clear case of heart failure. According to Dr. Haydock, the vicar was found at his desk, peaceful-like. Must have happened around 3:45 yesterday afternoon, judging by his watch." "His pocket watch?" Miss Marple inquired innocently. "The gold one?" "That's right. Stopped at 3:47, lying on the desk beside his right hand." "His right hand?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her faded blue eyes sharpened with interest. "That's what I said," Slack replied impatiently. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got paperwork to complete. Natural causes or not, there's procedures to follow." As the inspector strode from the vicarage, Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Wilson. "I wonder, might I see the Reverend to say a private farewell? We served on so many church committees together over the years." Mrs. Wilson hesitated. Well, I suppose that would be all right. Haydock is still with him. The study was exactly as Miss Marple remembered it from her many meetings with the vicar, walls lined with theological texts, the scent of pipe tobacco lingering in the air, papers neatly arranged on the broad oak desk. The only jarring note was the still figure seated in the leather chair, head tilted slightly as if in contemplation. Haydock, a tall, spare man with a gentle manner, looked up from his examination. Ah, Miss Marple. Come to pay your respects? Yes, doctor. It's such a shock. He seemed in perfect health yesterday, at the parish council meeting. Heart trouble can be like that, I'm afraid. Silent until the final moment, the doctor sighed. According to all evidence, it was quick and painless. A blessing, really. Miss Marple moved closer to the desk, her eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The vicar's reading glasses lay folded beside an open Bible. A half-finished cup of tea had gone cold, and there, gleaming softly in the afternoon light, lay the gold pocket watch that had been the Reverend's pride and joy. Such a beautiful timepiece, she remarked. I recall the Reverend once telling me it had been in his family for generations. Indeed, Dr. Haydock nodded. Stopped at the moment of death, it seems. 3:47 yesterday afternoon. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, examining the watch without touching it, curious that it should be lying there by his right hand. Is it? The doctor looked puzzled. Well, yes. You see, the Reverend was quite distinctly left-handed. I've watched him take notes during countless meetings. He always carried his watch in his left waistcoat pocket and checked it with his left hand, a habit of many years' standing. Dr. Haydock frowned. Are you quite certain, Miss Marple? Oh, yes. One notices these little things, you know. My nephew Raymond says I'm terribly observant about people's habits, a consequence of living in a small village for so many years, I suppose. The doctor's frown deepened as he gazed down at the peaceful face of the dead man. That is peculiar. And there's something else, Miss Marple continued, her voice lowered slightly. The vicar suffered from arthritis in his right hand, had done for years. He mentioned just last week that he found it increasingly difficult to write his sermons. I can't imagine him removing his watch with that hand. It would have been most uncomfortable for him. Dr. Haydock studied her thoughtfully. What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple? Miss Marple gazed back at him, her expression innocent, yet somehow knowing. I'm not suggesting anything, Doctor. Merely observing that sometimes the simplest details can be most revealing. In my experience, people's habits rarely change, especially in their final moments. She glanced once more at the still figure of the vicar, then at the gleaming watch beside his hand. I wonder, she said softly, if perhaps someone else placed that watch there after the Reverend had passed, and if so, one must ask oneself, why? As Miss Marple departed the vicarage, nodding politely to the gathering of villagers outside, she couldn't help but feel that the stopped hands of the vicar's timepiece were pointing towards something far more troubling than a simple case of heart failure. And in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, such secrets rarely remained buried for long. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Beneficiary. The drawing-room of the vicarage had taken on the peculiar hush that accompanies the reading of wills. 3 days had passed since Reverend Clement's unexpected death, and the villagers of St. Mary Mead had dutifully attended his funeral that morning. Now the inner circle of those with potential interest in his worldly possessions had gathered at the solicitor's request. Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting needles working with rhythmic precision. She had been invited by the vicar's sister, Miss Dorothy Clement, a thin, nervous woman with whom she had served on countless charitable committees. I do appreciate your coming, Jane. Dorothy had whispered earlier, clutching Miss Marple's arm with surprising strength. It's all been so sudden. I hardly know what to think. Mr. Benson, the solicitor from Much Benham, cleared his throat importantly, an elderly man with pince-nez and a manner as dry as the documents he handled. He had served the Clement family for decades. Now that we are all assembled, he began, glancing around the room, "I shall proceed with the reading of the late Reverend Clement's last will and testament." Miss Marple's observant gaze travelled around the gathered mourners. Dorothy Clement sat rigidly upright, her black-gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her was the vicar's nephew, Timothy Clement, a young man with a restless manner and what Miss Marple had always thought of as city clothes, too fashionable by half for St. Mary Mead. His recent arrival from London had caused something of a stir in the village, particularly as he had been estranged from his uncle for some years. On a separate settee sat Colonel Prothero's son, James, his military bearing evident even in repose. His presence at the will reading had raised Miss Marple's eyebrows. She was unaware of any particular connection between the young man and the vicar, beyond the usual parish relationships. The church warden, Mr. Rawlinson, occupied an armchair near the fireplace, a substantial man in his 50s with thinning hair and gold-rimmed spectacles. He had managed the church's financial affairs for over a decade, with what the parish council considered exemplary dedication. And finally, somewhat apart from the others, perched on a straight-backed chair near the window, sat Miss Hartley. The vicar's secretary was a quiet, marsy young woman of perhaps 30, whose capable efficiency had kept the parish running smoothly for the past 3 years. Her plain face was partially concealed by an unfashionable hat, and her eyes were red-rimmed from recent tears. "The will is surprisingly straightforward," Mr. Benson continued, "dated only 6 months ago and properly witnessed by Dr. Haydock and myself. I, Edmund George Clement, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my worldly possessions as follows." The solicitor's voice droned on through the standard legal formalities. Miss Marple's knitting needles never faltered, though her attention remained keenly focused on each face in turn. "To my sister, Dorothy Mary Clement, I leave the sum of £5,000 and my collection of silver, which has been in our family for generations." Dorothy's face remained impassive, though her fingers tightened momentarily around her handkerchief. "To my nephew, Timothy James Clement, I leave my pocket watch and the sum of £1,000, with the sincere hope that he will find his way to a more purposeful existence." Timothy's expression darkened momentarily at this barbed bequest, but he quickly composed his features into appropriate solemnity. "To the parish of St. Mary Mead, I leave my theological library, with the exception of those volumes specifically designated elsewhere in this will." Mr. Rawlinson nodded approvingly, making a note in a small black book he had produced from his pocket. "To Mr. James Prothero, I leave my collection of fishing equipment and accompanying journals, in recognition of our shared passion for the sport and in memory of our many conversations on the subject." James Prothero looked genuinely moved by this gesture, a slight flush rising to his tanned cheeks. "And finally," Mr. Benson paused, adjusting his pince-nez, "to my faithful secretary, Miss Amelia Hartley, I leave my entire collection of first edition books, including my prized Dickens and Trollope volumes, along with the sum of £2,000, in gratitude for her unwavering service and keen literary appreciation." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Miss Hartley's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Dorothy Clement half rose from her chair, her face contorted with sudden fury. "That cannot possibly be right," she exclaimed. "Those books are worth a fortune. They've been in our family for generations. Edmund would never—" "I assure you, Miss Clement, the will is perfectly clear," Mr. Benson replied calmly. "Your brother specifically mentioned that Miss Hartley had shown exceptional interest in and knowledge of the collection. He felt they would be properly appreciated in her care." Appreciated. She manipulated him. That's what she did. Dorothy turned her angry gaze toward the secretary, who had shrunk back in her chair. "Always there with her tea and sympathy, weren't you? Making yourself indispensable. Getting him to confide in you when his own family hardly saw him." "I never," Miss Hartley began tremulously. "The remainder of the estate, Mr. Denson continued firmly, raising his voice over the brewing argument, including the vicar's personal effects, not otherwise specified, and any remaining funds after taxes and funeral expenses is to be divided equally between St. Mary Mead Church and the Diocesan Mission Fund. The announcement effectively silenced Dorothy, though her face remained flushed with indignation. Timothy Clement was studying Miss Hartley with newfound interest, his expression calculating. Mr. Rawlinson continued making notes, occasionally glancing toward the secretary with poorly concealed surprise. As the gathering began to disperse, Miss Marple approached Miss Hartley, who remained seated, looking rather stunned by the proceedings. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "would you care to take tea with me tomorrow afternoon? I imagine you could use a friendly ear about now." The younger woman looked up gratefully. "That's very kind, Miss Marple. I would appreciate that." "Excellent. 3 o'clock at my cottage, then." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she noticed Timothy Clement engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with James Prothero in the hallway. Their voices were too low to distinguish words, but their body language suggested disagreement of some kind. Timothy's hands gesticulated sharply, while James stood with arms folded, his military posture unyielding. Outside the vicarage, Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Mr. Rawlinson. The church warden appeared troubled, repeatedly removing and polishing his spectacles, a habit Miss Marple had observed in moments of stress. "A surprising will, wouldn't you say, Mr. Rawlinson?" "Indeed, Miss Marple. Most surprising. Were you aware of the vicar's interest in book collecting? I know he treasured his library, but I had no idea some volumes were so valuable." Rawlinson replaced his spectacles carefully. "The Dickens alone must be worth several £100. First editions, you know, and the complete Barchester Chronicles by Trollope, quite rare in such pristine condition, and all going to Miss Hartley. How interesting that she shared his passion for literature." "Yes, interesting." He hesitated. "Miss Marple, did you happen to notice anything unusual about the vicar in the days before his death?" "Unusual? In what way?" He had been reviewing the church accounts with particular attention, asked for records going back several years. "Most unlike him, he usually left the financial matters entirely in my hands. Perhaps he was concerned about parish finances. The roof fund has been struggling, I believe." "Perhaps." Rawlinson frowned. He also spent considerable time in the parish archives, though he wouldn't say why. Old records, birth and death, registers from decades ago. Miss Hartley was helping him. Research for a sermon, he claimed, but it seemed different somehow. They had reached the gate where their paths would diverge. Miss Marple paused, her keen eyes studying the church warden's troubled face. "Mr. Rawlinson, do you believe the vicar's death was entirely natural?" The question hung in the air between them. Rawlinson's hand tightened on the gate latch. "I wouldn't presume to question Dr. Haydock's diagnosis," he said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, just an old woman's fancy," Miss Marple replied lightly. "But I've always found that when things don't quite fit together properly, like the vicar's watch being in his right pocket when he was left-handed, there's usually something worth investigating." Rawlinson stared at her. "His watch? I didn't know. Such a small detail, really. Probably nothing at all. Good day, Mr. Rawlinson." As Miss Marple made her way home, her thoughts were not on her knitting pattern, but on the curious threads that seemed to be emerging from what the police had dismissed as a simple case of heart failure. The valuable books bequeathed to a secretary, the vicar's sudden interest in old parish records, Timothy Clement's unexpected return after years of estrangement, and the oddly placed pocket watch, separate threads that might, with careful examination, reveal a pattern far more complex than it initially appeared. Chapter 3. The Watchmaker's Testimony. Morning mist clung to the ancient tombstones as Miss Marple made her way through St. Mary Mead's churchyard. The old Saxon church stood sentinel, its weathered stone witness to centuries of village secrets. Miss Marple paused briefly at the freshly turned earth that marked Reverend Clement's final resting place. The soil was still dark and raw, adorned with flowers that had yet to wilt, chrysanthemums from the Women's Institute, roses from the choir, and a small, unpretentious bunch of forget-me-nots that Miss Marple knew had been placed by Miss Hartley. The church clock struck 9 as she emerged from the grounds onto the high street, where shops were just beginning to open. Among these was the modest establishment of Giles and Son, clockmakers and jewellers, situated between the baker's and the haberdashery. The bell above the door announced her entrance with a melodious chime. Giles, a slight man with wispy white hair and perpetually ink-stained fingers, looked up from his workbench. Magnifying glasses perched upon his forehead gave him a somewhat owlish appearance, an impression reinforced by his habit of blinking rapidly when addressed. "Miss Marple, good morning to you. What brings you to my humble establishment today? Not your grandfather's mantel clock again, I hope." "No, Mr. Giles. That's keeping perfect time thanks to your expertise," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "I've come on a rather different matter. It concerns the late Reverend Clement's pocket watch." The watchmaker's hands stilled above the disassembled mechanism he had been examining. "Ah, a terrible business, the vicar's passing. A fine gentleman, always so particular about his timepieces. Indeed, I understand you maintained his watch for him?" "That I did, Miss Marple. That beautiful gold half-hunter had been in the Clement family for generations. Georgian craftsmanship at its finest. You don't see workmanship of that caliber these days." He shook his head regretfully. The vicar brought it in regularly, every 6 months without fail, for cleaning and adjustment. Miss Marple settled herself on the customer's chair, arranging her tweed skirt carefully. "I believe he had it serviced quite recently." "Just last month," Mr. Giles nodded vigorously. "A minor issue with the winding mechanism. Nothing serious. I had it sorted within the day. When he collected it, I assured him it should run perfectly for at least 6 months." "How curious, then, that it should stop so suddenly," Miss Marple mused, her faded blue eyes watching the watchmaker's face closely. Mr. Giles frowned, removing his magnifying glasses entirely. "Stop? But that's most unusual. The mainspring was in excellent condition. Unless the watch was deliberately stopped." He blinked rapidly, or perhaps suffered a severe jolt. "Dropped from a height, perhaps." "I see." Miss Marple's fingers tapped thoughtfully on her handbag. "When the vicar came to collect his watch, did he seem his usual self?" The watchmaker considered this. "In most respects, yes, though now that you mention it, he did seem somewhat preoccupied, less inclined to chat about the parish affairs than was his custom." "Did he happen to mention what was troubling him?" "Not in so many words." But Giles hesitated, glancing toward the shop window as if concerned about being overheard, despite the empty street outside. "I did witness a rather uncomfortable encounter later that day. The vicar was leaving the post office when young Mr. Prothero, the colonel's son, approached him. Their conversation appeared quite heated." "James Prothero?" Miss Marple's interest visibly sharpened. "Could you hear what was said?" "Only fragments. Something about family reputations and best left buried." The vicar seemed to be attempting to calm the young man, but Mr. Prothero departed in evident agitation. Giles adjusted a small screwdriver on his workbench, aligning it perfectly with its fellows. Most unusual to see the vicar engaged in such a confrontation. He was generally so mild-mannered. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "One last question, if I may. This pocket watch, was there anything distinctive about it besides its age and craftsmanship?" Mr. Giles' face brightened with professional enthusiasm. "Oh, indeed. That's what made it such a fascinating piece. Like many gentlemen's watches of that period, it contained a secret compartment, a small cavity behind the inner case. Such hiding places were often used for locks of hair, miniature portraits or other keepsakes. And in the vicar's watch, was the compartment empty? Not at all. It contained a small brass key of unusual design, quite old by the look of it, when I asked about it. The vicar merely smiled and said it was a family mystery. The watchmaker's eyes twinkled. I assumed it was for a diary or private papers. Gentlemen of an earlier generation were rather fond of keeping their personal correspondence under lock and key. A key, Miss Marple repeated softly. How very interesting. As she took her leave of Mr. Giles, Miss Marple's thoughts whirled with new possibilities. The confrontation between the vicar and James Prothero, coupled with the mysterious key, added intriguing dimensions to what was becoming an increasingly complex puzzle. Her path back through the village took her past the vicarage, where she observed Timothy Clement emerging in apparent haste. His expression was tense, his movements furtive as he glanced up and down the lane before striding rapidly away. Seized by a sudden impulse, Miss Marple altered her course to intercept him. "Good morning, Mr. Clement. What a pleasure to see you again, though under such sad circumstances." Timothy started visibly. "Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." "No, indeed. One advantage of advancing years, people rarely notice one's presence." She smiled disarmingly. "Are you staying long in St. Mary Mead? I understood your business normally keeps you in London." Yes. Well, there are matters to settle regarding Uncle Edmund's estate. Paperwork, you understand." He glanced at his wristwatch. "If you'll excuse me, I have an appointment in Much Benham." "Of course, though before you go, I was just speaking with Mr. Giles about your uncle's pocket watch. Such a beautiful heirloom. I believe it's come to you now." Timothy's face darkened momentarily. "Yes, though I haven't received it yet. The police are still holding it, apparently. Some formality or other. How vexing for you. Though I suppose Inspector Slack must follow procedure. Your uncle was most particular about that watch, I understand. Had it serviced regularly by Mr. Giles?" "Was he? I wouldn't know. Uncle Edmund and I were not close in recent years." "Yes, I had heard something to that effect." Miss Marple's expression was sympathetic, yet somehow penetrating. "A disagreement of some kind, I believe." Timothy's jaw tightened. "Family matters. Nothing of interest to anyone else." "Quite so. Families can be so complicated, can't they? Your uncle was always very discreet about personal matters, though I understand he was researching family history recently, parish records and such." For a brief moment, alarm flashed across Timothy's face before he smoothed his features into polite indifference. "Was he? How tedious. If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I really must be going." As he hurried away, Miss Marple watched thoughtfully. The mention of parish records had clearly disturbed the young man, though he had tried to conceal it. Another thread to add to her mental tapestry. The remainder of the morning passed in routine village activities, purchasing fresh eggs from the farm, exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Blade at the bakery, and attending a brief meeting of the hospital committee. But throughout these mundane tasks, Miss Marple's mind continued to sift through the accumulating evidence surrounding the vicar's death. By early afternoon she had reached a decision. Tea with Miss Hartley was not scheduled until 3 o'clock. That left ample time for another visit to the vicarage, this time to examine the Reverend's study more thoroughly than had been possible during her condolence call. Miss Marple approached by the garden path, noting with practiced eye that someone had recently walked across the damp soil of the flower beds. The impression of a man's shoe was clearly visible beneath the study window. "Curious, Mrs. Wilson admitted her with the same red-eyed solemnity as before. "I was just making tea, Miss Marple. Would you care for a cup? That would be most kind. And perhaps while it's brewing, I might sit quietly in the Reverend's study. I find it comforting somehow to be surrounded by his books. He had such a fine theological library." "Of course, no one's disturbed anything in there. Can't bring myself to start clearing it yet." The housekeeper sniffed. "Though Miss Dorothy was asking about some of the first editions already. Not seemly, if you ask me. with him barely cold in his grave. The study was much as Miss Marple remembered it. The leather chair where the vicar had breathed his last, the oak desk with its green blotter, the walls lined with bookshelves. But now, with no other observers present, she could examine the room with greater attention to detail. The desk drawers were unlocked, containing nothing more remarkable than sermon notes, parish correspondence, and church bulletins. The blotter, when lifted, revealed no hidden papers. The bookshelves held mainly theological works, biblical commentaries, and church histories, with a separate section devoted to the first editions that had caused such consternation at the will reading. It was only when Miss Marple knelt somewhat stiffly to examine the lower shelves that she noticed a small wooden box tucked behind a row of hymnals. Withdrawing it carefully, she found it to be locked, a simple brass lock that immediately brought to mind the key Mr. Giles had described. Her fingers had just traced the keyhole when Mrs. Wilson entered with the tea tray. Miss Marple smoothly returned the box to its hiding place. "Here we are, Miss Marple. I've brought some of my seed cake as well. The vicar was always partial to it." "How thoughtful, Mrs. Wilson. Tell me, did the vicar often receive visitors in the days before his death?" "Not more than usual. The regular parish business, you know, though young Mr. Prothero did come by one afternoon. Left in quite a state, he did." "Indeed? Did you happen to overhear their conversation?" Mrs. Wilson looked slightly uncomfortable. "I wouldn't want to speak ill of anyone, Miss Marple." "Of course not, but if there was some disturbance—" "Well, they did raise their voices toward the end. Mr. Prothero was saying something about family matters being private, and the vicar replied that truth had a way of emerging whether one wished it or not." The housekeeper frowned. Most unlike the vicar to be involved in any sort of quarrel. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "And Miss Hartley, did she assist the vicar with his research into parish records?" "Spent hours, they did, poring over those dusty old books. Birth records, marriage registers, death certificates from decades ago. The vicar said they were tracing the history of some local families for a paper he was writing." "Which families in particular?" "I couldn't say for certain, though I did hear him mention the Prothero name once or twice." Mrs. Wilson leaned forward confidentially. "Between ourselves, Miss Marple, I think he'd found something that troubled him greatly. The night before he passed, I heard him pacing in his study until the small hours. Most unlike him." As Miss Marple departed the vicarage some time later, her mind was alight with new connections. The vicar's research into parish records, the confrontation with James Prothero, the key hidden in the watch, and the locked box behind the hymnals, all pieces of an increasingly complex puzzle. And somewhere within that puzzle, she felt certain, lay the true explanation for Reverend Clement's untimely death. Chapter 4. Letters in the Library. The afternoon sunlight filtered through Miss Marple's lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the blue Wedgwood tea service. Miss Hartley sat perched on the edge of the chintz-covered armchair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Despite the warmth of the day, she had not removed her cardigan, a faded brown affair that did nothing to enliven her complexion. "I can't thank you enough for inviting me, Miss Marple," she said softly. "The past few days have been difficult, I can well imagine." Miss Marple poured tea with practiced precision. "Milk and 1 sugar, if I remember correctly." Miss Hartley looked surprised. "Yes, that's right. How did you know? I've observed you at parish functions, my dear. One develops an eye for detail in a village like St. Mary Mead. People's habits become familiar." She passed the delicate cup, rather like the vicar's habit of carrying his watch in his left waistcoat pocket. The secretary's hand trembled slightly, causing the teacup to rattle against its saucer. "His watch? Yes, a beautiful gold piece, Georgian, I believe Mr. Giles said, with a most interesting hidden compartment containing a small brass key." Miss Hartley set down her cup untouched, her eyes suddenly wary. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Miss Marple." "I'm not suggesting anything, my dear. merely noting that when a left-handed man is found with his prized possession in his right pocket, and when that possession contains a key of some significance, one naturally wonders. A moment of silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Hartley seemed to be weighing something in her mind, her gaze fixed on the floral pattern of the carpet. "The vicar trusted you, Miss Marple," she said finally. "He spoke of your perception, your understanding of human nature. Most kind of him, I think." Miss Hartley drew a deep breath. "I think he would want me to show you what we discovered." From her handbag she withdrew a small brass key, identical to the one Miss Marple had heard described by Mr. Giles. "This is a duplicate. The vicar had it made last month, after he began to suspect certain irregularities." "Irregularities of what nature, my dear?" "In the church accounts. Nothing obvious at first. Small discrepancies that might easily be attributed to clerical error. But as we examined the records more closely, a pattern emerged: funds consistently misallocated, donations recorded but never deposited, expenses inflated beyond their true cost." "And who maintained these accounts?" "Mr. Rawlinson, the church warder. He's handled the financial affairs of St. Mary Maid Parish for over 12 years. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I see. And the key?" "It opens a locked drawer in the vicar's desk, a drawer containing the evidence he had gathered. He kept the original key in his watch for safekeeping, knowing no one would think to look there." Miss Hartley's voice quavered. "The day before he died he told me he intended to confront Mr. Rawlinson with what he'd found, but he never had the chance." A shadow passed across Miss Marple's face. "My dear, are you suggesting—" "I don't know what to suggest." Miss Hartley's voice dropped to a whisper. "But I do know the vicar was troubled, deeply troubled by something else he had discovered in the parish records, something concerning the Prothero family. James Prothero was seen arguing with the vicar shortly before his death," Miss Marple observed. "Something about family reputation and matters best left buried." "Yes, it began with the research for the parish history. The vicar was examining birth and marriage records from the 1880s when he noticed certain discrepancies in the Prothero lineage." "What sort of discrepancies?" "Dates that didn't align properly. A marriage recorded suspiciously soon after a birth, names that appeared and then vanished from subsequent records. The vicar became convinced there was some secret being concealed, something that would cause considerable distress to the current generation if revealed." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. "And did he share his suspicions with James Prothero?" "He felt obligated to do so as a matter of pastoral care. He believed in truth, but not in unnecessary pain." Miss Hartley twisted her handkerchief. "The meeting did not go well. James left in a fury, warning the vicar to abandon his research." The mantel clock chimed 4, startling both women. Miss Hartley glanced at it anxiously. "I should go?" "Mr. Rawlinson has called a meeting of the parish council for 4:30. As the vicar's secretary, I'm expected to attend." She placed the brass key on the table between them. "I've shown you this because I believe you'll know what to do with it. The vicar trusted your judgment." After Miss Hartley's departure, Miss Marple sat for several minutes in contemplation, her gaze fixed on the small brass key. Then, with a decisiveness that belied her years, she reached for her hat and coat. The vicarage stood silent in the late afternoon light, its windows reflecting the burnished gold of approaching sunset. Wilson had gone to visit her sister in the neighboring village, leaving the house temporarily unattended, a circumstance Miss Marple had ascertained during their earlier conversation. The study door yielded to her gentle pressure. Inside, the room retained its scholarly atmosphere, undisturbed since her visit that morning. The leather chair, the bookshelves, the oak desk, all waited in mute testimony to their absent master. Miss Marple approached the desk, noting that its surface had been tidied since her last visit, papers stacked neatly, pens arranged in their holder, blotter straightened. Someone had been here in the interim, someone with an eye for order. The central drawer contained nothing of interest, just the usual paraphernalia of clerical life. But on the right side of the desk was a smaller drawer with a brass lock that matched the key now in her possession. It turned smoothly, the mechanism clicking open with well-oiled precision. Inside lay a manila folder containing several sheets of paper, covered with the vicar's distinctive slanting handwriting. Beside it was a small leather-bound notebook and an envelope addressed simply, "To be opened in the event of my death." Miss Marple's heart quickened as she lifted the envelope. The flap was unsealed, suggesting its contents had been reviewed recently. Inside was a single sheet of paper dated just 3 days before the vicar's death. "To whom it may concern," she read, "I have, in the course of my duties, uncovered evidence of financial malfeasance within the parish accounts maintained by Mr. Harold Rawlinson. Detailed records of these irregularities can be found in the accompanying notebook with dates and specific amounts noted. The total sum misappropriated appears to exceed £2,000 over a period of 8 years, a betrayal of trust that has caused me great personal distress." Miss Marple turned to the notebook, which contained meticulous entries detailing discrepancies between reported and actual expenditures, donations recorded but never deposited, and systematic manipulation of accounts to conceal the ongoing theft. The manila folder contained something equally disturbing: photocopies of parish register pages from the 1880s, with certain entries highlighted and annotated in the vicar's hand. One annotation in particular stood out, confirmed by Mrs. Bellingham's diary. The child was born to Ellen Trent, housemaid at Prothero Hall, and adopted by the family after her dismissal. The true father appears to have been Colonel Prothero's own father, making the current James Prothero's claim to inheritance questionable. Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing with the implications. The vicar had uncovered not one but 2 explosive secrets: financial misconduct by a trusted church official, and a century-old scandal that threatened the Prothero family's position in county society. Either revelation could provide a motive for silencing him. A sudden noise from the hallway startled her, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. Hastily returning the papers to the drawer, Miss Marple locked it and pocketed the key. She had barely stepped away from the desk when the study door swung open to reveal Mr. Rawlinson. The churchwarden's surprise at finding her there was evident, but he recovered quickly. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to find anyone here. Mr. Rawlinson, I was just saying a private farewell to the vicar's study. So many parish meetings held here over the years, you know. So many fond memories." She smiled placidly, though her heart was racing. Indeed, his eyes moved past her to the desk, lingering momentarily on the locked drawer. "I was just collecting some papers for this afternoon's parish council meeting. Financial matters, always tedious, but necessary. Of course, I won't keep you from your duties." Miss Marple moved toward the door, her demeanor one of elderly benevolence. Such a responsibility, managing the church finances. The vicar was fortunate to have someone so dedicated. Something flickered in Rawlinson's eyes, weariness perhaps, or calculation. "It's been my privilege to serve," he said smoothly, "though I fear these matters become increasingly complex." The vicar, bless him, never had a head for figures. No, indeed, though he was most methodical in other respects, his record-keeping, for instance, quite meticulous. Rawlinson's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Was there something specific you wished to discuss, Miss Marple?" "Not at all. I merely came to sit quietly among his books. There's something so comforting about a well-loved library, don't you think? Each volume holding its own secrets, waiting for the right person to uncover them." As Miss Marple made her unhurried way from the vicarage, she was acutely aware of Rawlinson watching her departure from the study window. The weight of the brass key in her pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step, as did her conviction that Reverend Clement's death had been neither natural nor accidental. Turning onto the high street, she caught sight of an unexpected figure emerging from the post office, Mr. Rawlinson's wife, laden with shopping bags. Miss Marple adjusted her course to intercept her. "Mrs. Rawlinson, how fortuitous. I was just thinking of calling on you." Martha Rawlinson, A stout woman with anxious eyes perpetually magnified by thick spectacles appeared startled by the greeting. "Miss Marple, I am afraid I'm rather in a hurry. Harold expects me back by 5. This won't take but a moment. I merely wish to ask, is it true that you and Mr. Rawlinson are planning an extended trip abroad?" Mrs. Price at the post office mentioned something about currency exchange forms. Mrs. Rawlinson's face blanched beneath its careful powder. "I don't know what you mean. We have no immediate travel plans." "How curious. I was so certain." Miss Marple affected mild confusion. "Perhaps it was another couple I heard about, though I could have sworn Mrs. Price mentioned passport renewals as well." "Excuse me, Miss Marple, but I really must go." Miss Rawlinson clutched her shopping bags tighter, her knuckles whitening. "Harold will be wondering where I am." As the woman hurried away, Miss Marple's gentle expression hardened into one of grim determination. She retrieved the small notebook she always carried in her handbag and made a brief entry, then turned decisively toward the police station. Inspector Slack would be reluctant to reopen an investigation declared closed, particularly on the word of an elderly spinster, but the evidence in the vicar's desk, coupled with what appeared to be hasty departure preparations by the Rawlinsons, might be enough to convince even the most stubborn of officials that the death of Reverend Clement warranted closer examination. Chapter 5. The Secretary's Confession. Evening descended upon St. Mary Mead like a velvet curtain, drawing shadows across gardens and lanes that had basked in sunshine mere hours before. The transition from day to night seemed to Miss Marple a fitting metaphor for how swiftly certainty could give way to doubt, clarity to confusion. Inspector Slack had received her information with characteristic skepticism, his mustache twitching with barely concealed impatience as she recounted her discoveries. Only the production of the vicar's note and the brass key had prevented him from dismissing her concerns outright. "I'll look into these allegations against Mr. Rawlinson," he had conceded grudgingly. "Financial impropriety is a serious matter, but as for reopening the investigation into the vicar's death, that would require substantial evidence of foul play, Miss Marple, more substantial than a misplaced pocket watch and village gossip." Now, as she sat by her fireplace with a half-finished piece of knitting in her lap, Miss Marple reflected on the tangled threads of the case. The embezzled church funds, the Prothero family secret, the mysterious research in parish records. Somewhere among these disparate elements lay the truth about Reverend Clement's death. But which thread, when pulled, would unravel the entire tapestry? A gentle tapping at her front door interrupted her reverie. Cherry, who had been dozing in the kitchen, hastened to answer it, returning moments later with a rain-spattered Miss Hartley. "I'm so sorry to disturb you at this hour, Miss Marple," the secretary began, her voice strained with evident distress, "but I couldn't bear it any longer. The pretense, the fear, the terrible uncertainty. My dear child, you're shivering. Come, sit by the fire. Cherry, would you bring us some hot tea?" Miss Marple set aside her knitting and leaned forward, noting the younger woman's pallor and the feverish brightness of her eyes. "Something has happened, hasn't it?" Miss Hartley sank into the offered chair, her rain-dampened coat clinging to her slight frame. "Someone broke into the vicarage study tonight. I had returned to collect some personal items, letters I had left in my desk drawer. The place had been ransacked, papers scattered everywhere, books pulled from shelves, even the carpet partly lifted, as if someone was searching beneath it." "Did you report this to Inspector Slack?" "I went directly to the police station, but the inspector was out investigating another matter. The constable took my statement, but seemed to think it was probably just local boys looking for valuables." Miss Hartley twisted her gloves in her hands. "But it wasn't random vandalism, Miss Marple. Whoever searched that room knew exactly what they were looking for. The vicar's evidence against Mr. Rawlinson. Perhaps, or perhaps." She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her tightly clasped hands. You know something more about the vicar's death, don't you? Miss Marple's voice was gentle but insistent. Something you haven't shared with anyone. I loved him. The words emerged as a whisper, forced from depths of emotion long suppressed. Not in a romantic sense, or at least I never allowed myself to think of it that way. He was 20 years my senior, a man of God, my employer, but there was a connection between us, an understanding that went beyond ordinary friendship. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes compassionate. I suspected as much. The way you spoke of him, the depth of your grief, it suggested a bond of unusual strength. He knew, I think, though we never acknowledged it openly. Perhaps that's why he left me his books. They had been the foundation of our relationship, our shared passion for literature and history. Miss Hartley's voice steadied as she spoke of their intellectual connection. We would spend hours discussing Trollope and Dickens, debating theological interpretations, exploring historical mysteries, and this shared intellectual life led to your assistance with his research. Yes, at first it was purely academic, the parish history, documenting the lineage of prominent local families. But then we discovered the irregularities in the Prothero records. She leaned forward earnestly. You must understand, Miss Marple, the vicar never intended to cause pain or scandal. He believed that truth, however uncomfortable, was preferable to perpetuating falsehood. The truth regarding James Prothero's ancestry. Miss Hartley nodded. The child born to the housemaid, Ellen Trent, was not formally adopted, as the family claimed. He was the illegitimate son of the elder Prothero, James's great-grandfather, by a servant girl who was subsequently dismissed and sent away with a small settlement. The child was raised as the son of the Prothero heir and his wife, who had been unable to conceive, a convenient arrangement for all concerned, except that it created a false line of inheritance that continues to this day, and Reverend Clement shared this discovery with James Prothero. He felt morally obligated to do so. The deception did not invalidate James's legal position. Too much time had passed for that, but it did mean that his blood connection to the Prothero legacy was not what he had always believed. Miss Hartley's expression darkened. James was furious. He accused the vicar of meddling in matters that didn't concern him, of threatening to destroy his family's standing in the community. He stormed out, warning that if the vicar spoke a word of this to anyone else, he would regret it bitterly. The rain pattered against the windows, punctuating the silence that followed this revelation. Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly, assembling the pieces of this increasingly complex puzzle. And yet, despite this threat, the vicar continued his research. He was troubled by the confrontation, but determined to document the truth, not for public exposure, but for historical accuracy. Miss Hartley's voice faltered. The day before he died, he told me he had made a decision. He would record the facts in a sealed document to be placed in the parish archives, not to be opened for 50 years. By then, he reasoned, all parties directly involved would have passed on, and the revelation would be of historical interest only. A sensible compromise, Miss Marple observed, but one that apparently came too late. The morning of his death, he asked me to prepare the special archival paper and binding materials. He seemed preoccupied but resolute. A tear slipped down Miss Hartley's cheek. That was the last time I saw him alive. Miss Marple reached over to pat the younger woman's hand. My dear, I must ask you something difficult. Where were you during the afternoon the vicar died? Miss Hartley stiffened slightly, but met the elderly woman's gaze directly. I was cataloguing books at the parish library until 5 o'clock. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's sister, was there as well, sorting donations for the church jumble sale. She can confirm my presence. I see. And after that, I returned to my cottage and spent the evening alone reading. She smiled faintly. Not a very good alibi, I'm afraid. Few of us who live alone have reliable alibis for our evenings, Miss Marple replied mildly. One more question, if I may. The brass key that opens the vicar's desk drawer, you said he had a duplicate made. Why? For safekeeping. He kept the original in his watch and gave the copy to me, with instructions to use it only if something happened to him. Miss Hartley's expression became troubled. Miss Marple, do you believe the vicar was murdered because of what he discovered? Before Miss Marple could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the front door, more authoritative than Miss Hartley's tentative tapping had been. Cherry appeared in the doorway, her young face anxious. "It's Inspector Slack, miss. He says it's urgent." The inspector entered without waiting for an invitation, his bulky form filling the small sitting room. Water dripped from his hat onto the carpet as he surveyed the two women with narrowed eyes. "Miss Hartley, I've been looking for you. Your neighbors said you left your cottage in some distress earlier this evening." "I came to consult Miss Marple about the break-in at the vicarage," she replied, her voice steadier than her trembling hands would suggest. "Indeed?" The inspector's tone was dry. "Well, I have news that may interest you both." Mr. Harold Rawlinson was apprehended, attempting to board the evening train to Southampton, carrying a considerable sum in cash and bearing a passport with a fresh visa for Argentina. His wife was waiting in a taxi with their luggage. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "Argentina has no extradition treaty with Britain, I believe." "Precisely." When confronted with the evidence found in the vicar's desk, Rawlinson broke down rather spectacularly. Confessed to embezzling church funds for years. Apparently he'd developed a taste for gambling that his income couldn't support. The inspector tugged at his moustache, a habit Miss Marple had observed when he was reluctantly impressed. "Your information proved most valuable, Miss Marple." "And the matter of the vicar's death?" she prompted. "Rawlinson denies any involvement, claims it was simply convenient timing. Says the vicar confronted him with evidence of the embezzlement the day before he died, but offered him a chance to make restitution privately, without criminal charges. They arranged to meet the following afternoon to discuss terms." "The afternoon the vicar died," Miss Hartley whispered. "According to Rawlinson, when he arrived at 4 o'clock, he found the vicar already dead at his desk. Panicked, thinking he'd be suspected due to their financial dispute, he arranged things to suggest the death had occurred later, after his visit, by deliberately stopping the vicar's watch at 3:47 and placing it where it would be noticed. In the right pocket, instead of the left," Miss Marple murmured. "Exactly. He claims he had no knowledge of the vicar's left-handedness, merely placed the watch where it seemed natural to him." The inspector frowned. A convenient story, but possible. "Oh, Dr. Haydock's initial examination was consistent with death by heart failure, though the time was estimated rather broadly, between 2 and 5 in the afternoon." Miss Hartley leaned forward anxiously. "Do you believe him, Inspector?" "I'm not paid to believe, Miss Hartley, but to investigate, and my investigation has now expanded to include the possibility that the vicar's death was not due to natural causes." He turned to Miss Marple. "Which brings me to another matter. The break-in at the vicarage this evening. Nothing appears to have been stolen, but the study was thoroughly searched. Would either of you have any idea what the intruder might have been looking for?" Miss Marple and Miss Hartley exchanged glances. It was the secretary who spoke first. "The parish records," she said quietly. "The evidence concerning the Prothero family." As Miss Hartley recounted the details of the vicar's historical research and James Prothero's angry reaction, the inspector's expression grew increasingly grave. The steady drumming of rain against the windows provided a somber backdrop to her narrative of century-old secrets and present-day threats. "Two separate motives," Miss Marple observed when Miss Hartley had finished. "Financial exposure and family scandal either might drive someone to desperate measures." "Indeed," the inspector closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "I think it's time I had a conversation with Mr. James Prothero about his movements on the afternoon of the vicar's death." He glanced at Miss Hartley. "And I'd advise you to be careful, miss. If there is a killer in St. Mary Mead, and if that person believes you share the vicar's knowledge, you could be in considerable danger." After the inspector's departure, the two women sat in silence, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. The house creaked and settled around them, the familiar noises of an old cottage that had weathered countless storms. "You should stay here tonight," Miss Marple said finally. "The guest room is always prepared, and I would feel better knowing you were safe. Tomorrow we can consider what further steps might be necessary." As Miss Hartley retired to the offered room, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her knitting abandoned in her lap. The case was taking shape in her mind, the disparate threads slowly weaving into a coherent pattern. But the most crucial thread, the one that would reveal the hand behind Reverend Clement's death, remained elusive. Outside, a shadow moved briefly across the rain-streaked window, then vanished into the darkness. A fleeting presence, gone almost before it registered in Miss Marple's peripheral vision. She rose stiffly and drew the curtains closed, troubled by the sensation that someone had been watching the cottage. Mary Mead, where everyone knew their neighbor's business, such furtive observation was both unusual and ominous. As she secured the locks on doors and windows before retiring, Miss Marple reflected that the evening's revelations had transformed what had seemed a simple case of heart failure into something far more sinister, a deliberate act designed to silence a man who had uncovered too many uncomfortable truths. And somewhere in the village, the person responsible was growing increasingly desperate as their secrets teetered on the edge of exposure. Chapter 6. The Time of Death. Dawn arrived in St. Mary Mead with a pearlescent light that transformed the rain-washed village into something almost ethereal. Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window, observing the delicate mist rising from her garden as she contemplated the revelations of the previous evening. The embezzled church funds, the century-old scandal that threatened the Prothero legacy, the mysterious intruder at the vicarage, each element suggested a different path to the truth, yet somehow they must converge. She had slept poorly, her dreams disturbed by the image of that fleeting shadow beyond her window. The sense of being watched had lingered through the night, like a discordant note in a familiar melody. In her experience, such intuitions were rarely mistaken. The soft creak of floorboards in the hallway announced Miss Hartley's awakening. Minutes later, the secretary appeared in the doorway of the breakfast room, her face pale but composed. "I've made a decision," she announced without preamble. "I'm going to leave St. Mary Mead. There's nothing for me here now that the vicar is gone. And these revelations have made staying impossible." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "A hasty departure might be interpreted as an admission of guilt, my dear." "Guilt? I have nothing to feel guilty about," Miss Hartley protested, though a flush rose to her cheeks. "I loved him, yes, but I would never have harmed him, never." "I believe you," Miss Marple said gently, "but Inspector Slack might view your departure differently, and there is still the matter of the vicar's bequest, those valuable first editions. It would be a shame to abandon them after he so clearly wished you to have them." Miss Hartley sank into a chair at the breakfast table, her earlier resolve visibly wavering. "I hadn't thought of that. The books, they're all I have left of him, of our conversations, our shared passion for literature." "Precisely. And I suspect there may be something else the vicar left for you, perhaps unknowingly." Miss Marple poured tea for them both, the familiar ritual bringing momentary calm to the troubled atmosphere. "Tell me, did the vicar make any notes during his research into the Prothero family history?" "Extensive ones. He was most methodical in his documentation." "And where are these notes now?" Miss Hartley's brow furrowed. "In his study, I suppose. Or perhaps scattered across the floor after last night's break-in. Unless," Miss Marple suggested delicately, "they were what the intruder was seeking, in which case they may now be destroyed, or in the possession of someone with a vested interest in keeping the Prothero secret hidden." The secretary's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The first editions," she whispered. "The collection he left to me, several of them had his personal annotations in the margins. He often used them as a form of private journal, noting thoughts and observations he didn't wish to record elsewhere." "Precisely," Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "And these books are now still at the vicarage?" They were to be transferred to my cottage once the will was fully processed. Miss Hartley set down her teacup with a decisive click. We must examine them immediately. The morning mist had begun to lift as the two women made their way to the vicarage. The village was stirring to life, blinds being raised, shopkeepers unlocking their doors, the milkman completing his rounds. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, there was a subtle tension, an awareness that something had fundamentally shifted in the peaceful community. They found Mrs. Wilson in the kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed, but her movements brisk as she prepared a tray of tea and toast. Inspector Slack is in the study with Timothy Clement, she informed them, her tone disapproving. Been there since 6:30, going through the poor vicar's papers again, as if he hasn't suffered enough indignity. Mr. Timothy is here? Miss Marple inquired mildly. I understood he was staying at the Blue Boar. Came rushing over at first light. He did. Said he had information for the inspector. Mrs. Wilson sniffed. Always thought there was something not quite right about that young man. Too smooth by half. Miss Marple and Miss Hartley exchanged glances. Their shared suspicion unspoken but understood. As they approached the study, raised voices could be heard through the partially open door. I've told you everything I know, Timothy Clement was saying, his tone defensive. Yes, I argued with my uncle about money. Yes, I was in debt. But I certainly didn't kill him. Yet you were seen leaving the vicarage at approximately 3:30 on the afternoon of his death, Inspector Slack countered. A time you previously claimed to have spent at the solicitor's office in Much Benham, a claim Mr. Benson categorically denies. I misspoke. I was confused about the timing. The shock of my uncle's death was considerably less shocking to you than to others, given that you were the one who discovered his body and conveniently adjusted his watch to suggest a later time of death. There was a moment of stunned silence before Timothy replied, his voice now shaking with either fear or anger. That's preposterous. Who told you such a thing? Your uncle's pocket watch contained fingerprints, Mr. Clement. Yours, quite distinctly, on both the case and the winding mechanism. Miss Marple cleared her throat delicately, stepping into the doorway. I believe I may be able to shed some light on this matter, Inspector. All eyes turned to her. Inspector Slack's impatient, Timothy Clement's alarmed, and a third pair belonging to James Prothero, who sat quietly in the corner, his military bearing somewhat diminished by evident exhaustion. Miss Marple, the inspector acknowledged with barely concealed irritation. This is an official police inquiry. Indeed, and in the spirit of assisting your inquiry, I should like to propose a small demonstration. She turned to Miss Hartley. My dear, would you be so kind as to fetch the vicar's collection of first editions? I believe they may prove most enlightening. While Miss Hartley went to locate the books, Miss Marple surveyed the assembled company with the deceptively mild gaze that had so often perceived what others overlooked. Timothy Clement sat stiffly in his uncle's chair, his fashionable attire incongruous with his haggard expression. James Prothero maintained his distance, positioned near the window, as if contemplating escape. The inspector stood by the desk, his notebook at the ready. I have been considering the matter of time, Miss Marple began conversationally. In particular, the significance of the stopped watch. We know it was deliberately set to show 3:47. But the question remains by whom and why that specific time. Rawlinson has already confessed to tampering with the watch, Inspector Slack pointed out impatiently. Yes, but Mr. Rawlinson claims to have found the vicar already dead when he arrived at 4 o'clock. If that is true, then the vicar must have died sometime before 4. But how much before? That, Inspector, is where the first editions become relevant. Miss Hartley returned, carrying a stack of leather-bound volumes which she placed carefully on the desk. These are the most frequently annotated, she explained, opening the topmost book, a first edition of Trollope's Barchester Towers. Within its margins were neat pencil notations in the vicar's distinctive hand. The vicar used these books as a form of diary, Miss Marple explained, turning the pages until she found what she sought. Ah, yes, here. dated the day before his death. 2C arrived unexpectedly, demanding money. Claims gambling debts must be paid or severe consequences will follow. Suggested church funds as temporary solution. Horrified by the suggestion, Timothy Clement half rose from his chair, his face flushed. That's taken out of context. I never suggested stealing from the church. Yet you did visit your uncle to request financial assistance, Miss Marple pressed. And you were aware that he had uncovered Mr. Rawlinson's embezzlement. I didn't know the details, only that there were irregularities in the accounts that troubled him. Timothy sank back into his chair, visibly deflating. Yes, I needed money. I've made some unwise investments, but I would never have harmed my uncle. Miss Marple turned to another book. This one, a Dickens first edition. The vicar made additional notes on the morning of his death, meeting with J.P. most distressing. His anger at family revelations exceeded all reasonable bounds. Threatened exposure would be met with resistance by any means necessary. James Prothero's face remained impassive, though his knuckles whitened where they gripped the windowsill. The vicar was meddling in matters that didn't concern him, he said stiffly. Family history should remain private, even when built upon deception. Miss Marple inquired gently. The truth about your great-grandfather's parentage would not have affected your legal inheritance, merely the perception of your bloodline. The Prothero name has stood for honor and breeding for generations. To have that questioned, to become the subject of village gossip and country house whispers, it would have been intolerable enough to silence the vicar permanently. Before James could respond, Miss Marple opened a third volume, a first edition of Austen's Emma that had clearly been well loved. The vicar's final entry, written, I believe, shortly before his death, have resolved the matter of J.P.'s family history, will place documentation in sealed archive, not to be opened for 50 years. T.C.'s financial situation more troubling. Evidence suggests cooperation with R. in misappropriation of funds. Confrontation at 3 this afternoon could prove difficult. If persuasion fails, must consider formal accusations. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications of these words registered with each listener. Inspector Slack was the first to speak. 3 o'clock, not 4, and suggesting complicity between Timothy Clement and Rawlinson. Precisely, Miss Marple nodded. The vicar had discovered not only Mr. Rawlinson's embezzlement, but also his nephew's involvement in it. Timothy had accumulated gambling debts far beyond his means. Mr. Rawlinson had been systematically defrauding the church for years. Together they had established an arrangement, Timothy's silence in exchange for a share of the misappropriated funds. Timothy Clement leapt to his feet, his composure finally shattering. You can't prove any of this. It's all speculation based on cryptic notes in old books. On the contrary, Inspector Slack interjected. Mrs. Rawlinson has been most forthcoming since her husband's arrest. She confirms regular payments to you over the past year, Mr. Clement. Quite substantial payments. The vicar confronted you both that afternoon, Miss Marple continued quietly. First you, Timothy, at 3 o'clock. The meeting became heated. In a moment of panic, fearing exposure and disgrace, you struck your uncle, perhaps not intending to kill him, but with fatal consequences nonetheless. Then, realizing what you had done, you arranged the scene to suggest natural causes and reset his watch to a later time. Why would I change the time? Timothy demanded, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. To implicate Mr. Rawlinson, of course. You knew he was scheduled to meet the vicar at 4. By setting the watch to 3:47, you created the impression that the vicar died shortly before Rawlinson's arrival, making him the obvious suspect. But you made a crucial mistake. The left-handed watch placement, Inspector Slack murmured. Exactly. The vicar habitually carried his watch in his left waistcoat pocket, but you placed it by his right hand. A small detail, but revealing. Miss Marple's eyes were sorrowful as she regarded the young man who now stood pale and trembling. What you didn't anticipate was that Mr. Rawlinson, upon finding the vicar dead, would make the same assumption about the timing and would further adjust the scene to protect himself, inadvertently complicating your plan. Timothy Clement seemed to crumple inward, all pretense of innocence abandoned. It was an accident, he whispered. I just pushed him. I didn't mean for him to fall against the desk like that. When I realized he wasn't breathing, I panicked. The watch was just there. Setting it to implicate Rawlinson seemed like my only option. As Inspector Slack moved to formally arrest Timothy Clement, Miss Marple turned her attention to James Prothero, who had observed the proceedings with increasing discomfort. You, Mr. Prothero, are guilty of anger and poor judgment, but not of murder. Your confrontation with the vicar, while regrettable, occurred the day before his death, and I believe the vicar's final notes suggest he had found a solution that would have preserved your family's public standing while honoring historical truth. James Prothero straightened, his military bearing reasserting itself. I behaved abominably toward him, he admitted stiffly. The revelation was a shock. I said things I deeply regret. And the break-in at the vicarage last night? Miss Marple inquired, her tone conversational, despite the gravity of the subject. I feared what might be in his papers. James looked away, shame evident in his posture. After hearing of Rawlinson's arrest and the reopening of the investigation, I became concerned that the family history might become public knowledge in the ensuing scandal. I searched for any documentation, but found nothing conclusive. Because the vicar had already secured that information where it would remain private for 50 years, Miss Marple concluded gently. His final act was one of compassion, Mr. Prothero. Perhaps you might honor his memory by showing similar compassion toward yourself and the truth of your heritage. Later that evening, as Miss Marple and Miss Hartley sat by the fire in the small cottage on the edge of the village, a sense of melancholy permeated their conversation, despite the satisfaction of resolution. I still can't quite believe it, Miss Hartley said softly. Timothy seemed so normal, so ordinary. To think he could strike down his own uncle over money. The most dangerous emotions, my dear, are often the most commonplace: greed, fear, pride. Timothy feared exposure and financial ruin. His pride couldn't bear the thought of public disgrace. In the moment when those fears collided with the vicar's unflinching integrity, tragedy became inevitable. Miss Hartley gazed into the dancing flames. What will happen to the first editions now? They contain so much of the vicar's private thoughts. They belong to you as he intended. Perhaps, in time, they will bring you comfort rather than pain. A connection to the man you admired and the mind you cherished. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythm as familiar and reassuring as the village itself. As for the Prothero family secret, I believe the vicar's wish for 50 years of silence should be respected. Some truths, while important to acknowledge, need not be trumpeted from the rooftops. Outside, darkness had settled fully over St. Mary Mead. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a cleansed world that glistened under the emerging stars. Within the village, lights glowed in windows, lives continued, adjusting gradually to the revelations that had shaken their small community. The ancient church stood silhouetted against the night sky, its tower a reminder of permanence amid the shifting fortunes of those who sought shelter in its shadow. The hands of the mantel clock moved steadily forward, marking time with the same precision as the vicar's gold watch, a timepiece that had in its stillness revealed more than anyone could have anticipated. For in St. Mary Mead, as Miss Marple well knew, even the smallest details could illuminate the darkest corners of the human heart.